All right, hello, algebra fans. All right, this is the first day of the year for Algebra 1 117, and these are the lessons online. So they come in pretty handy. First lesson online actually kind of started in the middle here, so in the middle of the year, but I'm continuing everything on here, so I have everything, all my lessons online. You can access them at my webpage anytime for reviewing, if you miss a lesson, whatever, however you want to use them, but hopefully this helps you guys out. So let's get started here. First thing, again, this is chapter 1 and 2, and this is day 1. So we're going to talk, our first thing here is comparing numbers. So let's talk about that. Comparing numbers. Okay, and that's just using inequalities. It's pretty easy. And if I said like 5 and 3, you know 5 is greater than 3. All right, so you guys probably learned it a couple different ways back in the day. If you learned it as the alligator eats the bigger number, so if this is our alligator here, so we'll make that a little bit bigger. And notice the sharp teeth right there. And so that's not really an alligator. I guess it's a large shark. Okay, so we can just draw a little fin here too. There we go. Now it looks good. So the shark eats the bigger number. The way I learned it back as a kid was a little more, or a little less exciting. It always points to the smaller number. So 5 is greater than 3. It's always going to point to the smaller number. Okay? So in your homework, they're going to ask you to graph the number on a number line and then tell which number is greater. Well, before you even graph it on a number line, you can just kind of write out here and you say, well, which one's greater? And 5 is greater than 3. So I can write it two different ways. That's one way to write it. I can always say 3 is less than 5. Right? Now, this is an interesting thing, too, here. These symbols. Sometimes people get confused. They're like, oh, which one's a greater and which one's a less than symbol? Well, just remember, if you, like this one right here, if you actually tilt your head a little bit, and you can write that as an L. So that symbol pointing that way is less than, and then people always go, well, how do you do that as a greater than? And I'm like, well, you can turn that into a G if you want. Greater, G-A-T, greater. Okay? So there it is. So if less is L is less than, and greater is the other way, is pointing to the right. All right? So there are two ways to do that. So 5 is greater than 3, or 3 is less than 5. However you want to learn that, the symbol, but that's writing it twice. Now, those are pretty easy. But the problem is when you start getting negative numbers. If I compare negative 3 and negative 5, okay, what you have to remember is negative 5 is more negative than negative 3. So negative 5 is less than negative 3. Okay, that's important. And then again, I can write it this way. Negative 5 is less than negative 3. I can write it both ways. Negative 3 is greater than negative 5, or negative 5 is less than negative 3. Sometimes it helps on a number line, and let's just draw that because that's what you're going to have to do for a little bit for your homework here. If I put a 0, I always want you guys, when you're graphing a number line, I require you guys to have 3 numbers on your number line. I want to really, I like to have the number that you're graphing and then 2 numbers on either side of it. Okay? So I'm plotting 2 different numbers here, but if I ask you to plot one number, that's what I want you guys to do is plot the number and then number on either side. So even before we do this problem that I just wrote here, if I want you guys to graph like negative 3, this is really what I'd like you guys to do. Negative 3, this is negative 2 and negative 4. That's kind of crunchy together here, so let's clear this out here. Okay, so I can say, let's graph negative 3 again, make it a little bit nicer. Okay, so here, if I want to do negative 3, that's fine. And then on either side, I want to graph this is negative 4 and negative 2. Be really careful with this because what people do is they make this mistake. They put -3 and they go, oh, that's -2 and -4. Boo! Okay, that's like really, really bad. It's nice when it's positive because positive numbers are easier to graph. But you need to understand, the more you go this way, the more negative it is. Okay, so that's why this one's wrong and this one here is correct, because -4 is more negative than -3. Then comes -5, -6. Okay, so that's how you graph these guys. All right, and if you want to compare the numbers, so let's look at -3 and -5. All right, if you would graph -3 here, this is -4 and -5, right? It's more negative. That's why this -5 is less than -3. All right? So that's what I want you to do. Remember, 3 numbers on the number line when you're graphing a single number. All right? So if I ask you to graph, the number 8, I want you to write 8, and here's 7 and 9. That's the way I want you guys to graph it. And then I didn't really tell you, but put a little dot there, right? That's kind of what you're doing. And even like this guy here, -5 and -3. So put a dot to show me that the number you're actually graphing. Okay, and then of course, if I ask you to compare -5 and +3, that's actually really easy because you know that's negative, and so that's going to be less than. All right, so I would graph -5 and 0 and 3. Okay, so here's your -5 and here's your 3, so that is -5 is less than 3. Okay, that's pretty easy. So that's basically graph. Let's talk a couple more things too. Let's talk about fractions. So if let's graph, we have 1/2 and we have 2/3 and we have 1, and let's graph -1/2 and -2/3 and -1, just to kind of see where everything belongs in the number line. Okay, so I'm going to make a big old number line here. Here's 0. 0 is a nice reference point. Okay, and you need to understand that negative, I mean, if you use your calculator, which you're not allowed to in this chapter, but negative, or let's actually do the positives first. 1/2 is smaller than 2/3. I hope you guys understand that, right? 2/3 is a little bit more than a half, right? Because you have 1/3, which is smaller than a half, 2/3, which is bigger than 1/2, and then 3/3, which is back to 1. So if I'm graphing, if I put 1 here, 1/2 is right in the middle. And 2/3, well, if I just kind of mark it here, isn't this about 1/3 here, and this isn't about 2/3 right here? So 2/3 is a little bit more than 1/2. And that's where these points would be plotted then. Here's 1/2, here's 2/3, and here's 1. So same thing with the negatives. Here's -1. So that means -1/2 is between 0 and -1. And remember, again, this is -1/3 right here, -2/3, and -3/3, which is -1. So this is -1/3, which I didn't actually plot, but that's okay. -2/3. So here are points: -1, -2/3, and -1/2. Okay. So fractions, like if I asked you to graph -4/3, well, isn't -3/3 just -1? So isn't this even more negative? So isn't -4/3 here? Okay, so kind of watch what you're doing with the fractions. Okay, but if it's a fraction between 0 and 1 or 0 and -1, make sure you put it in between there and kind of figure it out. All right, so it's a pretty important thing here, and this is another part of the lesson is ordering numbers. Now, fractions are a little more difficult. Okay, but if I give you a bunch of decimals, so let's talk about ordering numbers. Okay, and we'll go from least to greatest. So let me give you a bunch of numbers here. In fact, what I'll do is we'll do one with just decimals. So -1, negative 1.2, negative 0.3, 0.1, 1.6, and 1.1. All right, so if I found my smallest number here, you guys should realize negative 1.2 is the most negative. Okay, so if I actually had to draw a number line, and here's 0, and here's negative 1, and here's positive 1, okay, this guy here, negative 1.2, is going to go right about there. And then negative 1 is there. We drew that in. Negative 0.3 is, right, isn't this a halfway point right here? So isn't negative 0.3 a little bit more over here? So that's negative 0.3. 0.1 is just a little bit more than 0. 1.6 is, we got to actually go a little bit farther out here, but it's 1.6 is going to be way out here. And 1.1 is just a little bit more than 1. So that's 1.1. So if I have to order these numbers, then it's negative 1.2, negative 1, negative 0.3, 0.1, 1.1, and 1.6. Okay, that's least to greatest. All right, so let's do one if I give you a fraction here. Okay, I'm not going to make it too difficult, but if I said negative 2/3, negative 0.5, negative 1/4, negative 1, negative 5/3, and negative 0.1. Okay, I did the trickiest one of them all. Positive numbers are easy. Negative ones are a little more difficult. So let's draw a nice big old number line. And what is the smallest number? What's the most negative number? You guys should realize that this guy right here is the most negative. It's negative. Write it as a mixed number. Sometimes when it's written as an improper fraction, it's a little more difficult to see it. But you guys should know that's negative 1 and 2/3. Okay, I basically, 3 goes into 5 one time, and you got 2 left over. That's negative 1 and 2/3. So negative 1 and 2/3 is way over here. And then the next one here is negative 1. And then now we have to kind of compare negative, that we can kind of convert. Isn't that the same thing as negative 1/2? So isn't negative 2/3 less than negative 1/2? Sure it is, because it's, 2/3, 2/3 of a pi versus 1/2. 2/3 is more of the pi than 1/2. So it's more negative when you put a negative sign. So here's negative 2/3. So that one's good. Now let's look at, compare the rest of them here. Negative 0.1. And again, if you guys are good with converting, isn't that the same thing as negative 1/10? Okay. If you didn't know how to convert that, you got 0.5 here. What's this in decimal? Isn't that negative 0.25? So we have negative 0.5, which is right here. And then we have negative 0.25. And then negative 0.1. So that's the order. That's from lowest to highest, or greatest. Okay? So if you don't have a calculator, you kind of just have to look at I'm not going to give you guys anything complicated like 37 over 52 compared to 1.379. If you had a calculator, you just type in the fraction and get the decimal, and then compare the fraction. Or the decimal. That's easy. But otherwise, I'm not going to be. I won't be too evil. All right. So that is comparison of numbers. Just remember, negatives are always lower than positives. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be negative 0.00000001 and 1 over 153. And you're like, well, how the heck do we know that? Well, you should know that is a lot lower. I shouldn't say a lot, but it's lower than this, right? Because that one's negative, and the next one here is positive. All right? So that's ordering numbers, lowest to highest. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, which actually is pretty mellow, is absolute value. And again, you guys should know a lot of this stuff. A lot of this stuff is review, but absolute value, the good mathematical definition is the distance from 0. Okay? And the reason I say distance from 0 is if you're at 0 and you have -1 or you have +1, this distance here is 1. And this distance here is 1. It's this distance, sometimes people look at this and go, well, isn't that -1? You never have negative distance. In other words, if I go from home to Conant, it's 5 miles. And if I go from Conant back to home again, it's 5 miles. I don't say, well, I don't look at my odometer and on the way to Conant it says, oh, it's 5 miles, and on the way back from Conant, the odometer goes in reverse because I'm going back to home. Okay, that doesn't happen. Otherwise, I would have like 0 miles in my car because I would always be returning back home, and that doesn't make sense. So it's always going to be a positive value. That's what it is, distance from 0. Okay, so here are the absolute value symbols. So the absolute value of -3 is, this is always going to be positive. That's huge. So it's 3. Okay? Absolute value of 6, don't get confused and say, oh, it's -6. It doesn't matter if it's a positive or negative. To start out with, the absolute value of 6 is also going to be positive. All right? That's really important. I can throw a couple of little tricky things in here. If I said negative, absolute value of -2. Okay, you want to do this first. You want to take the absolute value first, which is 2, and then that gets carried on after that. So that's actually equal to -2. Okay, so don't get thrown off and say, well, it's got absolute value, it's automatically going to be a positive number. Well, yeah, whatever's inside the absolute value becomes positive, but then you got to check on the outside and say, hey, what's going on the outside of it? So if I said negative absolute value of 7, you're going to do this first, which is 7, and then throw in the negative. Okay? If that negative's in the inside, negative absolute value of -21, that's going to be 21 because really the sign here is positive even though you don't write it, and that's why this is positive 21. Okay? So, and don't get thrown off by any kind of fraction or decimal. If I said, what's the absolute value of -1 over 1752? Don't go, oh man, it's such a nasty number. You should go, oh, that's pretty sweet. That's just 1 over 1752. Okay, the negative absolute value of 0.0037. Well, what's the absolute value of 0.0037? It's 0.0037, and then you throw a negative, and that's why you get negative 0.0037. Okay, so absolute value is really pretty mellow. Just remember what happens. You take the absolute value between those brackets, and then you look to see what's going on the outside. Okay, but don't get thrown off. I said just the absolute value of 105. Don't go, oh, well, it's negative. Okay, boo. It's always positive, and so it's 105. All right, that's it, math fans. That's day 1 of our first chapter 1 and 2 of 117. Hope you learned a little bit there, and we'll be back with our next chapter on lessons online. All right, that's it, math fans. Have a nice day. Goodbye.